Welcome back to the British Chronicle, your window into Britain's stories, memories, and timeless moments. If you enjoy this journey, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you'll never miss a new story. Once the map of Britain glowed with furnaces and turning wheels, towns sprang up around chimneys like barnacles around a ship's keel, and the country wore the proud nickname, the workshop of the world. These were not merely buildings of brick and beam. They were engines of destiny. From their doors came goods and wages, identities and skylines. They produced more than shells, cloth, and steel. They produced futures. But what becomes of a nation when the belts slacken, the whistles fall silent, and the roofs let in the rain? That is the riddle we follow across rail sidings and weeded yards, the factories that built Britain, and the strange quiet that followed when they were left to rot. How could something so important vanish so completely? Our first waypoint lies on the borderlands of Scotland and England, where the wind tastes faintly of the Solway Firth, HM Factory Gretna. Raised at breakneck speed during the darkest days of 1915–1916, it unfurled for miles, a wartime city disguised as a workplace. More than 30,000 souls labored here, many of them young women, Gretna girls, whose days were measured by shift sirens and the sting of chemicals. Their craft was cordite, the propellant the guns demanded in unsleeping quantities. Entire settlements, Eastriggs and Gretna, were laid out to house them, with shops, schools, even their own police. A place built solely for war, running day and night. It seemed to confirm Britain's industrial sinew just when the Western Front cried out for it. There was method behind the miracle. In the wake of the 1915 shell crisis, the new Ministry of Munitions marshaled capital, engineers, and railways with ruthless focus. At Gretna, chemists coaxed nitroglycerin and gun cotton into the paste they nicknamed the Devil's Porridge, a homely name for work that carried mortal risk. You can almost see the scene even now. The careful steps across earthen floors, the low hum of guarded conversation, the yard engines nudging wagons along their private rails while, beyond the fence, a cold dawn lifts. The smell of acid, the clatter of tins, the caution that held everything together like stitching. And then, just as quickly, purpose ebbed. 1918 ended the need. Assembly lines decelerated into memory. Buildings were stripped, auctions held, rails lifted. Some parcels slipped back into farming, others found second lives in small industries. But vast tracts were surrendered to thistle and moss. Today, fragments linger. Ruins, culverts, hedged-off foundations, signposts to a hidden metropolis that once fed a war and now feeds only curiosity. Stand there on a winter afternoon and you may feel it. A hush heavy with absent footsteps, as if the land remembers the caution and courage of those who trod it. Museums and memorials keep parts of the story alight. The Devil's Porridge Museum among them, inviting visitors to meet the workers and reckon with the risks they bore. Yet the landscape itself is the grander archive, a palimpsest where empire-speed construction, female industrial labor, and state-directed science left their marks. Pride and unease mix here. Pride in what was achieved under impossible pressure, unease at how swiftly such immensity could be dismantled, sold, and forgotten. How could something so large, so vital, fade to near nothing in a single generation? We leave Gretna with that question tucked like a ticket in the pocket and follow the rails south to a different kind of wartime aftermath, where the things the army no longer needed became the seedbed for a new vision of civilian industry. After the thunder of war, Britain looked inward. The silence of 1918 was not peace alone. It was also a reckoning with warehouses stacked with vehicles, materials, and tools no longer needed by the military. In Slough, a sleepy Berkshire town where fields met hedgerows, the government saw a solution. Here, on land once marked by barracks and depots, a new experiment was born, the Slough Trading Estate. It began modestly in the early 1920s when rows of redundant lorries, tanks, and motorbikes were hauled into vast sheds. Mechanics tinkered with them, selling what could be salvaged, scrapping what could not, but from these bones grew something larger. By 1925, private companies were invited in, drawn by cheap land, good railway connections, and the promise of a fresh start. Slough transformed almost overnight from a town of orchards and quiet lanes into a humming showcase of Britain's industrial future. The scale of ambition was striking. The estate grew into a carefully planned grid of factories, offices, and service buildings, a blueprint for the industrial park as we know it today. By the 1930s, more than 400 firms had settled there, producing everything from electrical goods to confectionery. Brands like Citroën assembled cars. Mars began turning cocoa into chocolate bars that would travel the globe. Thousands of men and women streamed through its gates each morning, their bicycles crowding racks, their footsteps echoing along freshly paved streets. Slough was not only a workplace, it was an organism with its own beating heart. The estate had a dedicated railway system, a fire brigade, hospitals, canteens, and even recreation grounds. It was a miniature city of industry, designed to embody modernity and efficiency. Smoke plumes rose like banners of progress, while the sound of machines blended into a kind of mechanical orchestra, relentless yet reassuring. For many, steady wages meant mortgages, cinema tickets, and Saturday trips to the market, small luxuries in an age of uncertainty. But progress has a way of outpacing its own creations. As decades passed, technology shifted, global trade routes reoriented, and the estate's first-generation factories began to falter. By the post-war years, some of the early brick halls already seemed outdated beside newer, sleeker constructions. The 1970s and 1980s brought closures and demolitions. Where presses and looms once thundered, silence pooled in empty rooms. Pigeons nested in rafters, and grass pushed through cracked asphalt. Slough kept operating, but much of its original industrial heart slipped quietly into history. Yet there is resilience in reinvention. Today, Slough Trading Estate still thrives, housing modern firms in technology, logistics, and film production. Behind polished offices and anonymous warehouses, the ghosts of its industrial birth remain. Look closely, and you might glimpse them. The curve of an old railway siding, a weather-stained brick wall, a carved lintel bearing a name half forgotten. They whisper of a time when Britain tried to turn war's excess into peace's prosperity, and for a moment succeeded. The estate reminds us that factories are not only machines and mortar, they are social experiments. They shape where people live, how they spend, and what they dream of. Slough became proof that industry could be planned, nurtured, even transplanted into unlikely soil. But it also stands as a reminder of impermanence, for the very innovations that built it also ensured its partial erasure. From Slough, our journey moves further north, to a city whose fortunes were once tied not to cars or confectionery, but to the coarse, golden fibers of jute. A city that rose on spinning wheels and looms, and then fell silent when the world no longer needed what it could so proudly weave. Dundee. A city once crowned the jute capital of the world, where the very air seemed spun with fibers. For more than a century, its heartbeat was the rhythmic crash of looms, echoing through vast halls and stone streets. At the center of it all stood Camperdown Works, a colossus of industry opened in the 1830s, which grew to dominate not only Dundee's skyline with its red brick walls and towering chimneys, but also its soul. At its height, Camperdown was the largest jute mill on Earth. It was a world entire. Within its walls, raw fibers from India were transformed into sacks, ropes, carpets, and countless other goods that traveled the globe. The mill was more than a factory. It had its own railway line, school, and hospital. Generations of families passed through its gates, enduring the long hours, the dust, and the roar, yet finding pride in the knowledge that their labor carried Dundee's name far beyond Scotland's shores. The jute industry was not just economic muscle, it was cultural identity. Families depended on its wages, communities orbited its needs. Workers entered as children, grew up under its roof, and often retired worn and weary from decades of toil. There was hardship, endless shifts, coughing lungs, the grind of poverty, but also solidarity. The mill shaped not only the city's economy but its working-class consciousness, fostering unions, strikes, and a sense of shared destiny. For Dundee, Camperdown was both lifeblood and burden. Its fortune tied the city to global trade networks stretching from Calcutta to London. Imperial links made the flow of raw jute possible, and British industry turned that flow into profit. Yet dependence bred fragility. When global demand faltered, when cheaper production rose elsewhere, the mighty looms of Camperdown stuttered. By the late 20th century, the writing was on the wall. In 1981, after nearly 150 years of ceaseless activity, Camperdown fell silent. Its closure was more than economic loss. It was the shattering of an identity. Thousands found themselves redundant, entire neighborhoods stripped of purpose. Where once smoke had poured into the sky, silence now weighed on the air. The mill's vast shell stood empty, windows broken, machinery rusting, as nature began its slow reclamation. For many Dundonians, passing those ruins was like walking by a graveyard. Each wall a reminder of parents, grandparents, and children who had once sweated within. And yet, memory resisted oblivion. Parts of Camperdown were later repurposed into business parks, leisure centers, and educational spaces. But many sections were left untouched. Bricks crumbling, steel beams leaning like old bones. These ruins carry their own dignity. They are not simply decay. They are monuments to endurance, whispers of a time when Dundee powered the world's industry through sweat and stubborn resilience. Stand among the ruins today and you might feel the echo of voices. The weavers shout, the whistles call, the footsteps at dawn. The silence here is not empty. It is heavy, laden with forgotten music. It forces the question, how could something so vast, so vital, vanish in less than a lifetime? From the fading mills of Dundee, we turn now to Leeds, where another industrial titan once stood, not in fibers, but in iron and engineering. There, the name Greenwood and Batley carried weight, a beacon of innovation and precision. But like so many others, its fate too was sealed by the relentless tides of decline. Leeds, once a city whose air shimmered with the sparks of iron and steel, where the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam were as constant as church bells. Here, Greenwood and Batley rose in 1856, a proud engineering firm whose reach extended far beyond Yorkshire. Their workshops built locomotives that thundered along new railways, weapons that armed the empire, machines that hummed in factories across the globe. For more than a century, the company's name was spoken with respect, its reputation for precision a badge of British industrial might. The factory's story is stitched tightly to the nation's fate. During the First World War, Greenwood and Batley's production lines roared day and night, supplying the munitions that fed the front. In the Second World War, they answered the call again, turning out weapons, aircraft components, and tools of war with relentless discipline. Thousands of men and women streamed through its gates, engineers, apprentices, munitionettes in overalls, each playing a role in the survival of the nation. For Leeds, the factory was more than an employer. It was a forge of identity, proof that ordinary hands could shape the destiny of nations. But wars end, and with peace came change. The mid-20th century saw Greenwood and Batley adapt, manufacturing electrical machinery, hydraulic presses, and even pioneering in fields like packaging technology. Yet the shadow of decline crept closer. Globalization and cheaper foreign competition gnawed at British industry. National policies failed to shield firms once considered untouchable. By the 1970s, Britain's industrial belt was loosening. Mills and foundries shuttered. Orders dwindled. Greenwood and Batley fought to stay afloat, but the tide was merciless. In 1984, the company entered liquidation. The loss rippled far beyond the factory walls. For Leeds, the closure meant more than empty workshops. It meant the erosion of community. Skilled tradesmen found themselves redundant, their crafts unwanted. Pubs near the works grew quieter. Shops lost customers. Whole neighborhoods felt the ache. Where once chimneys smoked and whistles summoned shifts, demolition crews moved in. Bit by bit, the sprawling complex was reduced to rubble, its ground later paved with warehouses and retail parks. Today, only fragments survive. A brick wall here, an iron beam there, swallowed by the anonymity of modern developments. To most passers-by, Greenwood and Batley is invisible. Its name lingers in history books, photographs, and the memories of those old enough to recall its hum. Yet for Leeds, the echo endures. The city itself carries the imprint of the factory's rise and fall. In its housing estates, in the old rail sidings, in the very pride of its people. Greenwood and Batley may be gone, but it remains a symbol of ambition, of sacrifice, and of the relentless impermanence of industry. From Leeds we travel east to the iron country of Teesside, where furnaces once painted the night sky red, and rivers of molten steel fed bridges, ships, and skyscrapers across the world. There, another story unfolds. Not of precision engineering, but of scale so vast it seemed eternal. On the banks of the River Tees, where the North Sea wind carries the scent of salt and iron, the furnaces of Teesside once burned like artificial suns. Founded in the mid-19th century, the steelworks at Redcar grew into one of the largest complexes in Europe, a sprawling city of fire and smoke whose output shaped skylines far beyond Britain. From railway lines to bridges, from warships to skyscrapers, Teesside steel stretched its sinews across the world. At its peak, tens of thousands depended on the works. Whole communities grew around the glow of molten metal. Families planned their lives by the shifts of the blast furnaces, day, night, and the eternal middle ground between. Children fell asleep to the distant rumble of conveyors. Men and women walked home with faces smudged by ash, their pride shining brighter than their soot-darkened clothes. The works were more than a place of labor. They were a living monument, a testament to human endurance and the belief that steel was the backbone of progress. But steel, like empire, proved vulnerable to the shifting winds of global economics. In the late 20th century, as demand fell and competition from cheaper producers abroad surged, the British steel industry faltered. Governments debated subsidies, unions demanded protection, but one by one, the great furnaces dimmed. For Teesside, the blow came hardest in 2015, when the last blast furnace at Redcar was shut down. With it went not only jobs, but a century of identity. The aftermath was raw. Families accustomed to steady work were forced into uncertainty. Shops and pubs that had thrived on steel wages withered. Streets grew quieter, pride dimmed, and anger lingered. The demolition that followed felt less like dismantling machinery and more like dismantling memory itself. Watching the towers fall, many said it was as if a chapter of Britain's story had been torn out and burned. And yet, even in loss, Teesside's furnaces remain symbolic. Their ruins stand as skeletons against the horizon, empty but not silent. They remind us of the price of progress, the fragility of once mighty industries, and the resilience of communities forced to reinvent themselves. For many locals, the land is not simply derelict. It is sacred ground. Every rusted beam is a relic, every torn conveyor belt a fragment of collective memory. Today, plans for the site's future stir debate. Some call for redevelopment into new industries, green energy, technology, logistics. Others demand conservation, arguing that the remains deserve to be preserved as monuments to the people who kept the fires burning. Whatever the outcome, Teesside Steelworks endures as a parable of both pride and loss. From here, the story darkens into secrecy. Deep in the woods of Wales lies another forgotten factory, hidden, dangerous, and silent. Not steel, not jute, not cotton, but explosives. A place where the air once crackled with risk, and where memory is now muffled beneath leaves and birdsong. Tucked away in the wooded hills of Wales near Porthmadog lies a site whose silence hides a dangerous past. Founded in 1865, this factory produced explosives for over a century. Its purpose was never to clothe or feed, but to arm, to turn chemistry into force, into power, into fear. During both World Wars and even into the Cold War, its bunkers and laboratories worked in secrecy, feeding Britain's arsenal while remaining invisible to most of its citizens. The factory's design reflected its peril. Buildings were scattered far apart, separated by earthbanks and blast walls, so that one spark would not set the entire complex ablaze. Workers moved carefully, each step calculated, their routines precise. Hundreds were employed here, yet their labor was cloaked in silence. Families knew little of what went on beyond the fences. To many, it was simply the works in the woods, a place both familiar and forbidden. Inside, however, danger was constant. Explosives were mixed, pressed, tested, and stored under strict control. Accidents, though rare, could be devastating, and every worker lived with the knowledge that one mistake might cost lives. Yet they carried on, their duty bound not by glory, but by necessity. While the headlines focused on battlefields abroad, the realization is clear. Britain's strength also depended on the hidden labor of those who toiled in shadows. But history moved on. By the 1990s, the Cold War was over, the demands of munitions had faded, and the factory's purpose dissolved. In 1995, its gates closed for the last time. Almost immediately, nature began its slow reclamation. Roofs sagged, weeds split the concrete, moss softened the harsh outlines of blast walls. Today, the land is part of a nature reserve. Walkers pass through groves of trees and hear only birdsong, unaware that beneath their feet lies a century of danger, secrecy, and sacrifice. The contrast is startling. Peace now drapes a landscape once shaped by violence. And so we arrive at the end of this journey across Britain's forgotten factories: Gretna, Slough, Camperdown, Greenwood and Batley, Teesside, Tor Vale, Trencherfield, and these hidden bunkers in Wales. Each site tells the same truth in different words. Factories were never just bricks and machines. They were cities within cities, shaping communities, building nations, and defining lives. Their decline reminds us how quickly even the greatest empires of industry can fall, leaving behind only ruins, memories, and unanswered questions. Today, some have found new life: mills turned into apartments, workshops into museums, engines restored for curious visitors. Others stand abandoned, their broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. They are not just industrial debris. They are monuments to ambition, resilience, and human cost. The smoke may be gone, but the stories remain. So we ask once more, how could something so vast, so vital, vanish so completely? And perhaps more importantly, what other stories, still buried in the soil and steel of Britain's landscape, are waiting to be heard? The machines may be silent, but the echoes have not faded.